Today, we're very proud to present Starting a Dropped Objects Prevention Plan, the 8-step guide for safety pros. The Safeopedia webinar has been made possible by Ergodyne. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you today's presenter, Nate Bohmbach.
Hey, thanks a lot, Jamie. Welcome, everyone. Happy November. We're very happy to have you. We want to give a big shout out and thank you to Safeopedia for allowing us this opportunity to take you through this training presentation. So with that, let's get started. So what we're going to cover today is we're going to take a step back and look at safety at heights as a whole and talk about what we call objects at heights management and how dropped object prevention fits into that. We'll talk a little bit about the risk specifically and general awareness surrounding the risk of dropped objects and other at height safety hazards that have to do with objects. We'll talk about the costs associated with those risks and then give you a quick update on what's going on in the world of standards and regulation, because there is a lot of conversation going on in that realm. So we're happy to answer any questions for you if things can be confusing. And then we'll dive into the meat of the presentation and talk about, okay, how do I start a program? There's a lot of stuff to consider. I don't know where to start, so oftentimes people just simply don't start, and that's not the right thing to do. So we'll get into that as well, and then we'll summarize at the end before opening it up to a few questions. So as a whole, we look at safety at heights as the all-encompassing subject matter we talk about for safety professionals, because safety at heights takes on a different meaning and some different magnitude of risk for workers at our job sites. So what people have done a very good job of in recent years and decades is concentrate on workers at heights, which is what they should be doing, learning how to keep our workers themselves safe at heights. Fall protection solutions, for example, other forms of personal protective equipment that may take on a different design or different look when used at heights. And then also, how are we getting workers to and from the at heights safe or work location, whether it be on a tower, on top of a high rise, in a bucket, anywhere really. How are people getting to and from those locations safely? What often is overlooked then or treated as secondary is how do we manage all of the tools and equipment in any of those objects the workers are using or dealing with when they're working at heights. Because ultimately, if we focus on the objects at heights and take a look at how we can manage those safely, we're doing the workers a better service and protecting them in a preventative manner. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through our 8-step program. So it mirrors workers at heights. If you look at fall protection solutions for workers, you look at dropped object solutions or fall prevention for objects. Then you have housekeeping at heights. Housekeeping can often be an overused afterthought of a term when you talk about keeping an organized workplace, but poorly used housekeeping practices can take on a different level of severity when done at height. And then finally, just like getting workers to and from the at heights work location safely, we want to make sure we're doing the same for the equipment that we are using and dealing with at heights. So that frames it up and gives you an idea why we talk about objects at heights management in addition to dropped objects. The reason this is becoming a hotter topic is because the injury and fatality rate continues to rise from dropped objects. These are some statistics from the United States, which does a good job categorizing falling objects. If you look at how the Bureau of Labor Statistics categorizes injuries in the US, they take a look at struck by object or equipment other than motor vehicles. And this category resulted in nearly 520 fatalities in the United States in 2015. The 2016 numbers should be out within the next couple of weeks, so check into the Bureau of Labor Statistics website for more information on that. But of this category, the struck by object category, you have struck by flying objects and you have struck by falling objects. Just over half or I should say just about half of that category was struck by falling object, and 247 people lost their lives from being struck by a falling object in 2015. The non-fatal injuries, by comparison, were just around 45,000 reported non-fatal injuries in the United States. Both of those numbers were up from the prior year. So what's going on in the world of equipment standards and regulation? Well, when we often confront a company and they say, well, we don't have to do anything about it because, you know, OSHA doesn't tell us that we have to do anything about it. That's not necessarily true. There are mentions in OSHA of falling object protection, but they don't give you a specific script to follow and how to prevent that. So this is where organizations like the International Safety Equipment Association and ANSI, ASSE, other organizations that aren't regulatory bodies, but voluntary consensus standards, this is where they come into play to try to outline some best practices for the equipment that can be used to help mitigate these standards. And many of you have probably heard that there's rumors of standards coming for dropped objects. And those rumors are very true, but to kind of clear the confusion from the air, it's not necessarily OSHA that's scripting specifics on dropped object prevention. The standards that are coming are equipment standards through ISEA. And there is a standard that is currently wrapping up its draft status, that is ISEA 121, that we hope eventually will be adopted by ANSI after the review process. Those of you who are very familiar with fall protection know ANSI Z359. This standard will look somewhat similar to that, in that it will be outlining design and testing criteria for dropped object prevention solutions. So these solutions include active controls, such as retrofit anchor attachments for tying tools off to, retrofit tool attachments that you apply to tools to connect a lanyard to, the tool lanyards or tethers themselves, and then containers in the form of hoist buckets, tool pouches, things of that nature. Again, these will be design and testing criteria for manufacturers like Ergodyne for us to give some consistency for how this equipment is designed and tested on the marketplace. Right now, anybody can manufacture a tool lanyard in their garage. This is going to give a script to manufacturers for how to do it safely, and then that can be transported into a best practice for end users to know that if they're using 121 certified equipment, they're using something that's been tested to a standard. This does not include passive controls like toe boards or netting, and it does not include PPE or protection solutions for dropped objects like hard hats and steel-toe boots for that matter. More information will be coming on this as the draft evolves and gets through its review process, but you can probably look at late in Q1 of 2018 for something more formal to hit the market. So I know that's not why all of you have signed on here today. The content that we want to provide you today is to try to give you a script for how to implement something on the job site, because all of this you can go into detail on and it's great, but when you're looking at all these different things that could potentially fall and become a dropped object, it's not as easy as buying one harness for every tool that you use, strapping it on every tool, and then tying it off to anchor points. It's really a confusing subject, and most people just shy away from it because they say, I don't have to do it, so I'm not going to do it right now. It's not on my priority list. But those of you who are thinking a little bit more proactively are hopefully signed on here today, and you're wondering, how can I roll something out? Because I know these standards are coming. I want to get ahead of it. So that's what we're hoping to do here today. So we'll outline for you an Objects at Heights roadmap to implement a program on your job site. But before we dive into the steps of that, it's important to differentiate the difference between a policy, and a program. A lot of you subcontractors on the line that work with general contractors are all being told, hey, you have to abide by our policy. We have something in our policy that says you must have a dropped objects program in place. Well, a policy is not a program. Okay, a policy establishes written rules that you must follow, but really the program is your organized efforts to follow those rules and address the problem at hand. So again, a policy by itself written is not a program, okay? And it can be part of a program, but it doesn't alone give you guidance or your employees guidance for how to carry out a safe program. So that's why you'll see in these next 8 steps that creating a policy is only one step in the overall program that we'll outline here today. So here's a look at your 8-step roadmap, and we'll cover each one of these steps in detail. But it starts with a very simple call to action and then ends with reviewing and expanding it to other locations, folks, job sites across to your company. So your call to action can come in one of 2 ways. Unfortunately, the way it sits today, the aha moment when people realize I need to create a program or do something about this comes in a reactive nature. There's either a near miss or worse, some incident that actually does happen where a worker gets hit by an object. And we've heard dozens upon dozens of stories of this, and everybody does have a story of a near miss or something that's fallen. So a lot of phone calls that we get are, hey, we had a drop occur, we need to get tool lanyards out on site. Similar to when fall protection was gaining momentum 20 years ago, and the phone call to fall protection companies were, hey, we had a fall, we need to get a bunch of harnesses on site. Well, it's not quite as simple and straightforward as that. But again, unfortunately, most calls that are happening are reactive in nature. But many of you are aware that there's a risk at hand, and you're trying to do the right thing by getting ahead of it and being proactive in nature. So implementing some type of a program before an incident occurs. It doesn't mean that just because there's an incident, you're not being proactive. A near miss, if you're getting involved and getting a program together, can lead to you being proactive. So that's kind of your kickoff into a program. And really, at this point, it doesn't matter if it's proactive or reactive in nature. The important thing is you're here today and you want to do something about it. So the first thing we recommend is to sit down and identify the risk as it is within your job or your company, and then define a scope. And the scope doesn't have to be everything at once. It's starting off small. So really, when you identify the risk, you're taking a look at the who, what, wheres, and whats. All right, the who's, the people who are affected, at risk personnel or others, where these risks are located, and what, the potential dropped objects or unsafe management. And then when is, okay, set goals and determine a timeline. And then we'll try to teach you and help you with the how. So let's look at each one of these in a little bit more detail, and hopefully some things will come to mind. So the who and where, you're looking within your own company, and then you're looking outside your company. So at a typical job site, you have multiple trades working at different tasks. You have different crews, and you safety managers have to work together with the project managers and how all this communication and scheduling happens. If there's at heights work going on up above, there are crews working on below, so you really have to try to manage a lot, and I applaud all of you for doing so and doing so effectively, but it really, gravity makes your job hard when you're working up above. So what you need to think about is identify your crews and how those crews' works are impacting others. And it's not just your own companies. There are dozens of other subcontractors working. There are clients that are walking the job site. There are delivery people dropping things off, distributors calling on you, and the general public. If you're working in a busy environment, there might be pedestrians walking. All of those individuals you have to consider when you look at the different jobs and are defining your scope. So that is who's affected and where, what locations on the job are affected, the who and the where. On top of that, it's not only individuals, but it's equipment, sensitive operations. You might be working on, say you're working on a wind tower, you're working on solar panels, sensitive tile or glass or other types of sensitive equipment that's being installed on the building, for example. Or if you're in a manufacturing environment, this isn't specific to construction or power generation. It might be dropping something from here to the floor, for example. So you have to think about not just the people that are at risk, but the equipment that's at risk as well. Then once you've considered all of this, it's going to be a little bit overwhelming. So what we want you to do is kind of list out these different areas and these different crews and assign a level of risk to them. Is it whether you use a low, medium, high scale, a red, yellow, green scale, and really look at your higher risk areas and your higher risk personnel affected, and then identify one or two locations that you can choose as a pilot study for this program. This is important. This is where we don't want you to try to rush out and implement everything at one time. You need to identify an area and a crew or a trade, for example, and focus on that and learn from it. And this will be the heart of your pilot study and ultimately is going to be the seed that spawns your entire program. So that's the who and the where. We've identified those one or two locations where we want to work on a pilot program. The next would be to look within those areas and identify the objects, tools, equipment that can fall from previous positions and become dropped objects. So you want to consider that and then list out those tools and equipment. We'll come back to those later. It's not just hand tools. It could be anything else that may fall from its previous position. Then identifying all of those, choose a half dozen. Maybe you want to get aggressive. Maybe there's a lot of tools that are being used and you choose 10 or 12. But if you're using specific tools and equipment more frequently than others, identify those as the ones you want to be usual suspects and have a higher risk of falling. And then we're going to make those part of our pilot program as well. So we had an example of this in a manufacturing facility that worked at Heights, where they wanted to choose a painting operation and a finishing operation within that facility as their pilot areas. And then we identified about 10 tools in each area that are used more commonly. And then they ultimately focused on those initially to treat as their pilot study. And then set goals. The planners that are on the call, if my wife was on the call, she would be one of these people. Establish a timeline, okay? Make sure you set a parameter so you can do a pilot study within, let's say, 30 days, or make it 2 weeks. But don't let something just go on forever or it's going to fizzle out. Establish a timeline for your pilot study, and then maybe even a longer term timeline for your full program. Let's say you want to kick this off at the beginning of 2018, and you're going to do a pilot study in January, and then you hope by July of 2018 you have your program in place. Make sure you set those goals for yourself. So now we have our pilot study scoped out. We have an area we're looking at, a crew that we want to be part of this study. And then we've got 6 to 12 tools that we've identified that we want to focus on making sure are within this scope. Then get out into that area and observe and assess the site. All right, just don't let people know, monitor them, their at heights work, what they're using, how they're using it. Are they staging different things for being lifted up, for example? How are they storing their hand tools when they're not using them? Identify these types of things and take notes on what is going to be more hazardous, and identify who's walking below, who's at risk below. Consider the hierarchy of controls, which we'll get into shortly, on how you maybe at a very early stage could help mitigate these risks. And then consider different types of solutions that you could possibly use. Also consider, how much clearance do I have between the work that's going on above versus the work going on below, and where, if I implemented tool tethering, may we tie off those tool tethers too. Just start thinking of those types of things and taking notes and observing people and how they're working. Then take a look at what's going on that may cause dropped objects to occur. Are you working in areas that might have inclement weather, for example, poor elements outdoors, high winds, extreme temperatures, for example, cold, extreme cold, extreme hot that could affect the body and cause dropped objects? Are there lifts that are being driven across or swung across areas where they could collide with something else? Poor housekeeping. Again, staging materials. Are there things that are being left on the edge of a scaffold, for example? And then how are people bringing stuff to and from worksite places? Are they literally putting 50 pounds of tools on their belt and climbing up 10 stories? Those are the types of things that you may want to change behaviors of. And then just look at overall site risks as well that may not be specific to dropped objects. And most importantly of all, don't look specifically at the level you're on. Consider all levels and not just the one you're standing on. Mentioned this briefly already. Are there unsafe conditions where you might have some work going on a second level that may impact the first level, even if tool tethering is being practiced? And then are there other things at play, other hazards that might come into play if you implement a tethering program? For example, rotating equipment. Are there harsh chemicals being used that could affect the equipment that you're using on the job site as well? There are tools out there. Many of you have job site evaluations, hazard evaluations. There are templates out there that you can record some of this. Here's an example of one that we use and we send out to individuals when we send out a sample policy. This allows you to walk through these areas and check off whether or not there's a hazard here or not, and then what types of solutions you could possibly use. And so those are the conditions. Now, are the workers doing unsafe acts? So is the sequencing that you have, is that improper in introducing dropped object risk to the job site? Are workers just complacent and leaving tools out on the side of scaffoldings, or just not properly storing them after they're using them? And then how are workers accessing those at heights applications? Are the ladders appropriate? Are they hoisting equipment up? And then how are they transporting it? Pre-task plans are available as well. Potential dropped objects, where they're located, and affected personnel. This is an example of another template that we have to give out. So as you're going through this observation stage, you may want to record this so you can come back to it and introduce risk mitigation. So now that you've done all this, this is really kind of a checkpoint where you need to make sure that you have commitment. And that is the top down commitment and a bottom-up commitment. You want your leadership to approve of this program, and you want the workers to be involved and committed to this program. So we suggest having a top-down and a bottom-up commitment through involvement. Don't just script all this out and tell workers you have to do it. Get them involved right now and tell them, hey, we want to make you part of this pilot study to prevent dropped objects. And with dropped objects, you're actually protecting all of the people that you're going to work with. It's not just yourself. So can we count on you to be part of this program? And then the leadership as well. They need to be part of this too, and they need to be committed. Because if you don't have that, your program is going to fall flat. So before you move on to step 4 that involves training, you really need to have commitment on all levels. So that brings us to step 4, where we're actually going to get these individuals involved and start training them. What we recommend you do is take a look at your crew, and there's always individuals that stand out as people that give you excellent feedback, true, honest feedback, and don't just push back on things. We encourage you to pick out 2 people if you're a little bit larger organization, or perhaps a smaller organization. One person can do both of these leadership emphasis. So you have a tools and installations champion. So that individual, if you have a separate tool crib and somebody that handles the procurement and issuing of tools and equipment, that this person can be your tools and installations leader. They're the ones that are going to control the inventory of tools and equipment and document the tools that are going at heights, and also choose the solutions that you're going to install on those. And then you have a process and use champion. So this person is going to be in charge of not the tools and equipment, but more so the human resources on the job. They're going to manage the personnel. They're going to identify hazards on the job site, and they're going to consider other competing hazards like ergonomics and so on and so forth as you implement this program. So together, these individuals are going to partner and help you get this thing rolled out. And then you'll take a look at the workers and designate responsibility levels. So here is just an example of a training program that Ergodyne has in place of taking somebody that's a basic awareness level of education that is good for all audiences, and then working your way up to a more of a program manager and trainer, which is going to be your HSE manager, trainers, safety directors, so on and so forth. And within your pilot area, you would assign individuals a certain level of competency and where you would expect them to be at when it comes to dropped object risks. Whether they're going to handle only tools, they never go to height, maybe they're just working in the tool crib and they want to be at the equipment installer level, or they're constantly handling the tools. They're the ones at height, wearing fall protection and using this, and they want to be authorized user and inspectors. Okay, so some of this overlays with the fall protection training, and if you want more information on it, please do let Safeopedia or Ergodyne know. And then you will hold an initial training. Okay, that initial training again will involve the people in your pilot study or your pilot program. So the 2 champions that you've anointed and any other individuals that you want to actually try this equipment out and use this at heights, and any other safety managers that you might want to get involved in this point. Let's say there's somebody working at a different site and you want to give them visibility to what's going on. They might want to be involved in this initial training that's taking place. So this group of pilot study folks will be trained to a certain level, and you can decide what level that is. And then what you do is you leave that training and you schedule a controlled implementation. This is going to be implementing a program within that pilot area. So you're going to go through, revisit your hazard evaluation and your pre-task planning, and you're going to go through those areas that you marked in red, for example, that have high risk for dropped objects, and you're going to walk down this hierarchy of controls and determine, hey, can I just eliminate this outright? And if I eliminate that, that's the best form of risk mitigation. Or the last and least effective is personal protective equipment, and that's just what most people are doing now. Everybody wears a hard hat and calls it a day, okay? What we're going to concentrate on is more of the engineering controls and administrative controls. So looking again, walking through this, can the unsafe condition be eliminated or substituted? If not, what are we doing for engineering controls? What are we doing for prevention? Now, prevention can come in two forms. Prevention can be passive prevention, like tow boards or netting, or it could be active prevention, like tool lanyards, containers, tool attachments, things of that nature. So fix any conditions. Let's say you are practicing tow boards, but there's missing tow boards. You want to get those fixed. Install netting in proper locations. If there's any equipment that's damaged that could result in a dropped object, you're going to want to replace that equipment or fix that equipment. And then take a look at work practices too. Are there housekeeping things that can be taken care of at this point? And the 3 T's, which Ergodyne calls trapping, tethering, and topping, that is your tethering solution that we will talk about and you can implement as well. Administrative controls, this is looking at changing the behavior of individuals. So can you establish zones, train more people, put up awareness material, implement procedures like hoisting versus carrying? Those are the types of things you would do here at this stage of the hierarchy of controls. A good example of this is creating zones on a job site. So for example, this job site, you would create a red zone where you would require individuals to practice prevention in the form of tethering, which is an engineering control, and they must wear PPE. So this is maybe at a higher level, for example, a level above, where you want people to wear their standard PPE, but also practice preventative. Then you look at yellow zones as an example. And this would be your PPE is required, but you don't have to practice tethering. So this might be the level directly below that red level, where it doesn't make sense to tether anything because you're at a lower level, but you still want everybody to wear their standard hard hat and PPE. And then green zones would maybe be a safe zone. Again, this is just an example. Some of you have this for other risks. It would just be carrying that over to dropped objects and objects at heights management. Then PPE, this is going to be stuff that you're already probably doing standard, so a lot of time doesn't need to be spent on this, but an important point to take away is we're not talking about PPE being exclusive of the other controls. We don't want to say practicing tethering, there's no need for hard hats, or wearing your PPE, there's no need for tethering. The key here is to work within this hierarchy and implement a variety of controls to deliver the safest environment for your workers. So once this is identified, you've got your tools listed, you identify solutions to use with those tools, and you procure and install those solutions, and then establish those administrative controls with the people that you've trained. And then send them out to do the work with these new solutions and new administrative controls, and observe and adjust if needed. So after you've gone back and forth a little bit with that and really fine-tuned some of the practices that are in place, now is when you can write your policy. So you want to freeze the processes that you've put in place with the pilot study, and you're going to write your policy based on these processes. This is the foundation of them. Whether it's the manager, the safety manager, and the champions that you've anointed, or just the champions, this is where you want to write a policy. And there are sample policies out there available for dropped objects that you can use to write a policy. Every policy should include an introduction and a scope. You need to define the scope of your object set heights or dropped objects policy. You need to identify who's responsible for what with that policy. And then based on the research you've done here through your pilot program, you have scripted hazard analysis, risk assessment, and task planning. So once that policy has been reviewed and adjusted if needed, now is when you launch it and get it out of that pilot stage. So you want to conduct training for a larger group of individuals and inquire and install solutions for all of the tools and equipment that are being used. So until this time, this has taken place in a much smaller scope with a pilot area in one trade, one location, one crew. And so you've been able to fine tune it and really polish it up so you feel comfortable about it. You know what works, you know what doesn't work. And once that is in place and you have the commitment of everybody else, this is when you can review and expand it to other areas, other jobs, other locations, and other tools for that matter. To date, you've been working with 6 or 12 tools that you're really learning from. Now is when you open it up and tether all of the tools at hand. So you've educated yourself and your team on this. They're used to it, so it won't feel like such a big chunk to bite off. And then what's most important in any successful safety program is to make sure that you're constantly assessing it and improving it. This is not something that's static, because you know what? The work that you do every day isn't static. It's constantly changing. There's new tools that are being introduced for specific jobs. There's new challenging environments that you're needing to work in. So you're going to have to revisit that policy and adjust the program, maybe kick off another pilot study at a different job location, and really continuously improve the program. There's an organization that I encourage you to check out called the DROPS organization that Ergodyne is members of. It stands for the Dropped Object Prevention Scheme. This has a ton of good resources, including a sample policy that are free to download on their website, which is dropsonline.org. And though they're more focused on offshore oil and gas, this really the best practices that they have available can be taken and adjusted for any type of job out there. So, and they encourage what's called a holistic approach, which is constantly monitoring, identifying hazards and assessing them, and then working to do better with them. So one more snapshot of your 8-step roadmap to implement a program. Just to summarize everything at the end here, just because there's no specific regulation out there doesn't mean that you should not have a program in place. So no specific regulation doesn't equal no need for an object set height program. It doesn't mean that the risk isn't there. And OSHA would be happy to tell you that, even though they don't have anything that is written in their construction or general industry regulations that have specifics to preventing dropped objects. They will, through the general duty clause and other letters of interpretation, point to standards like ISEA ANSI standards that say there is a readily available best practice out there. You as a safety professional should know about it, and your due diligence is to work within that. And they could cite you under the general duty clause. So don't wait for some regulation to come out to start implementing a program. Another important thing that we covered is having a written policy does not equal having a dropped objects program. A program is really a cultural thing that people have bought into and they're working with. Policy is just a written set of rules that can be part of a program. And a lot of this is in a higher level of detail, but don't panic, okay? Use the 8 steps and start in a pilot area that really allows you to practice and learn about dropped object, what tools are more challenging, what areas can be concerning, what other hazards can be introduced if I install some of these solutions. Start small within a pilot program and expand from there. Gain commitment. This is super important. If not, at the very, very beginning, after you've gotten through step 3 of the program, before you move on to train people, you want commitment from your leadership, and you want commitment from those who are going to be using the preventative equipment. It's got to be a top-down and bottom-up. And utilize a variety of controls, okay? Hard hats isn't the simple take care of everything answer for dropped objects. Dropping a spud wrench or spanner from the 50th story of a building to somebody below who's wearing a hard hat is not going to protect them very well. So using a combination of preventative, administrative, and protective equipment is going to give you a better overall blanketed approach to dropped object protection. Then review, expand, and manage utilizing a holistic approach. Continuously improve your program and call on others. Share it, share best practices. You'll find a lot of people starting to implement programs out there. And then, of course, lean on Safeopedia and Ergodyne for help. Ergodyne has a ton of good resources. Besides just products, you'll notice we did not promote any solutions in this training presentation. We have a lot of supportive material in terms of policies and administrative awareness materials and so on and so forth. And you know, Safeopedia is a gold mine for good education materials as well. So lean on us for help.
Nate, Ergodyne, big thank you. This was a great presentation, very informative.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie, and thanks to Safeopedia for providing such good content all the time and being a great partner. We look forward to getting more content out to all of you in the future.
Great. So thanks everybody on the line. You spent an hour out of your time. We really, really appreciate that. We're very grateful. And with that, thanks again, everybody. Take care and stay safe.